So we were talking about the question of which came first, racism or slavery. And it should be noted with respect to the church that this does need to be said, because again, it's these days the church is just really being thrown under the bus. The church didn't always do what it should, I don't think, in this respect, by far. But on the other hand, the church did do things. And I say under D, this denial of slaves' humanity, in all the ways we've been talking about it, an attempt to classify as subhuman, and there was that, is the early beginnings of the eugenics movement. And that's never gone away. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said, oh, you remember the eugenics movement? I said, well, do you want to talk about all the ways that it's still here? It isn't gone away. You know, Gattaca and whatever, those ideas live on. I mean, I don't think it's going to, if you're just a materialistic, atheistic evolutionist, you're going to believe in some kind of eugenics. It makes sense. If your commitment, if what you believe is the survival of the fittest, you want to help it along. It's your job. I mean, that's the way people see it. So, you know, people act like eugenics, oh, that was a terrible thing. It is a terrible thing. Terrible, terrible, terrible thing. But it's not gone away, just like slavery hasn't gone away. There's different sorts of slavery, not just racial slavery. I mean, we just had speaking in our church this past Sunday, and if you want to get them, you can. I can get them for you. Good friends of mine, Dr. Mark and Laura Ambrose. Mark Ambrose is working in Cambodia, and no small part of their work, and that of his wife especially, in discipling and engaging, is rescuing girls from the sex trade and getting people out of that. It's a horror. That's one of the world capitals of it is there in Cambodia. Yes.
I think today is the high point of slavery in the history of the world in terms of sheer numbers.
Yeah, yeah. And you remember what they said at that assembly. They said, you know, blot it out throughout all the world. We would pray for the blotting it out of it throughout all of Christendom and the world, because they understood that there was lots of places where the Christian faith hadn't gone and so forth and hadn't had influence. So calling for the whole shooting match. So the denial of their humanity and attempt to classify as subhumans was resisted not only by abolitionists but by emancipationists like Charles Hodge, The Unity of Mankind, a wonderful piece. You can see where he's going there, right? And even some slave promoters like Robert Louis Dabney and James Henley Thornwell, these last men argued for proper marriage laws, for slaves being taught to read the Bible, humanely treated, owners understanding that they own the labor, not the person of the slave, and so forth. And yes, they had a lot of other problems, but that does need to be understood and acknowledged. Christianity particularly challenged this and throughout the whole time. Now I just went back to page 3. We go to page 5. Well, how do we do this? And you always have to be careful here, because I'm now speaking I'm not a sociologist. I'm a minister of the gospel, and I know what the church should be, but I can't say how everything in society should be. I don't know, and neither does anybody else necessarily. And a lot of people expect a historian at this point to give all the answers, but there's no perspective. A historian must have proper historical perspective. So if you say, tell me right now what's going on in terms, you talked about the history, 19th century, early 20th century, how does what's going on right now precisely fit into that? Nobody knows the answer to that, because we don't have historical perspective. You can't live in times and have historical perspective. Some people can have a lot of insight into the times. You do find people here and there in history. I think Edmund Burke is a great example of somebody in his time in Britain who understood that what was going on in America was a war for independence, and he said, he was Irish, and he said to his own people, we should let them go. I mean, he had a pretty clear understanding of it. At the same time, he saw what was going on with the French Revolution was the overthrow of everything. So he said, this is the overthrow of civilization on the one hand, and what's going on in America is a different thing. And not very many people saw that, particularly British citizens, saw that at the time. Later, you say, well, a lot of people would see that. Yeah, because, hindsight's 20/20. Things become a bit clearer over the course of time. But I mean, part of it is you can't have. Can anybody have a calm discussion in any way you want to define that about the presidency of Donald John Trump? Can you have a calm, cool-headed, clear-minded discussion about it? No, I don't think you can. Because on the one hand, people are going to be very defensive, or they're just going to be surely attacking. I'm not saying you can't speak that way, but I mean a real discussion across these lines. I'm not saying individual persons can't be cool-headed and clear-minded about it. But I'm talking about a discussion where people may differ, but yet we particularly live in an era where if you differ, there's an immediate throwdown. Civil differences and civil discussion is not known much among us. So at any rate, we're somewhat becoming like, in terms of how partisan and how polarized we are politically. It's not something we've seen for a long time. It's not something we've seen really since the run-up to the U.S. Civil War. And then people say to me, let me just go a little further. People say, do you think we'll have another civil war? I don't know. I don't know what that means or what that would look like, because it wouldn't be sectional. That's not, it's not going to be one section of the country versus another section of the country. We're not even, the demographics give nothing that would suggest that. It wouldn't be sectional, because in fact the country is urban somewhat versus suburban, although Trump redefined a lot of the suburban voters went for the other candidates, the Democratic candidates who had gone for the Republicans. The urban voters stayed Democratic. And then outside of that, you got plenty of people who were rural Democratic voters going for the Republicans. So the bigger split is the urban centers. I mean, think of Illinois as just a little example. Because I've had people say, well, I had somebody the other day, Illinois is such a weird state. You got Chicago and you got the rest of it. I mean, look downstate. If you look at a map, it's really red and Chicago's really blue. And they were talking about it like it's weird. And I said, this is the way the whole country is. This isn't weird. It's that way. Go to any state and you'll see the same thing. There's nothing weird about it. So if that's the case, Civil War was a sectional conflict. And I think it would just, if you're saying, might there be some kind of internal violence in areas of persons clashing with other persons, there could be that. It could be that kind of a thing. It's not going to be anything like what the U.S. Civil War is, because our society is totally differently organized. It's not even a possibility of that in that way. So, but that doesn't mean there couldn't be a lot of violence. There could be. So how do we think of these things? And I'm just suggesting that we don't want indifferentism on the one hand. We don't want that in the church, that we're indifferent to our society, its needs, its problems. No, we should be brokenhearted as we look and say, you need to bow the knee to Christ. You need to, the reason your lives are so fundamentally messed up, the most fundamental reason they're messed up is not because you lack economic resources or cultural resources or social resources. That all may be tied in with it, but you lack Jesus Christ is the most fundamental thing. That's just what the church is coming and saying, always. So we don't want indifferentism, nor do we want politicization. Because if the church is politicized, it's just another agency clamoring for attention instead of the unique. And I use that word advisedly. Remember, unique means one of a kind, and it thus can't be modified. There's no such thing as most unique, very unique, quite unique. Don't say that if you're a student of mine, ever. If you're preaching in the pulpit, if you're a student, I will jump up. Objection? No, I'm just kidding. But no. But because Christ is unique in His person and in His work. And I mean it. He's one of a kind. And we don't want to debase that word there. But the church has a unique calling, a unique ministry. No other agency in the world is called and commissioned to do what only the church is. And we've got to appreciate that, because if the church doesn't do it, if the church so compromises that it becomes another political agency, whichever direction it goes, an adjunct of the Republican Party, of the Democratic Party, of whatever party, it must not be an adjunct of some party. It can't be that, because then the gospel is lost. The gospel is lost. And the gospel won't be lost. We know that. The church shall never perish, her dear Lord to defend. But what sort of health is it going to be? And we're not some kind of hyper-Calvinist. Well, the gospel won't be lost, so I don't need to worry about it. No, we should do what was in our power to make sure that the church keeps on track preaching the gospel and calling all men, women, boys and girls everywhere to believe in the Lord and to obey all that He has commanded, to teach and to carry out that commission. So I mentioned, different models of Christ in culture. Of course, Niebuhr talks about, there's the Christ of culture, Christ over culture. He says the Reform view is Christ the transformer of culture. And I have there's certain things he says there that have some helpfulness, and there are other things, and certain things are observatory. And are you observing? Is this descriptive or prescriptive? And if it's prescriptive, I think there are some problems that he runs into there, and others have recognized that. Don Carson brings forth some different models. Maybe you can ask him next fall, Lord willing. Don Carson is going to be the fall lecturer. So he'll be here, and you can ask him your questions about this. He's a very able man in so many of these areas. And then in the spring of not of the 22, but 23, then, Lord willing, Carl Truman is going to be here. And I'm going to quote him in a minute here, because he paid me $10. No, he didn't. But I'm going to get in touch with him and tell him he should. I guess I'm cheap, $10. So I say here, the precise shape of a political theology not only continues to divide the Christian world, but the evangelical and the Reform world. The precise relationship between church and state remains, the precise relationship, as Hodge puts it, one of the thorniest issues among us. One about which, this is important to note this, we need to all recognize this and not act like it's not true, about which we had confessional agreements in terms of the originals of the three forms of unity and the Westminster Standards, but no longer. Those have been changed, not only in the American context. It started in the American context. The disestablishment of the church and the clear institutional separation of church and state starts here, but it doesn't end here. And sometimes I've had fun with Dutch people who will say, well, and I'll say, well, it was Kuyper who did this in the Netherlands then. He looked to America and he said, I think they have a better model there, having this separation, and we need to go in and change the three forms here on these points and have something similar to what they have over there. And so I say in E, a number of thoughtful souls seek a third way of some sort, and of course thoughtful souls, I mean you and me. Thoughtful souls seek a third way of some sort between Constantinian triumphalism, we know what that is, and pessimistic withdrawal, striking the balance in the ministry of the church, being intentionally inclusive. Why would we want to be intentionally inclusive? Because we're supposed to gather in the nations. That is, by its very definition, a proper inclusiveness. Reaching out beyond our typical middle to upper middle class white, in some cases ethnic constituencies, and I cite Acts 10 there. I'm not suggesting that this is easy, but these are conversations I think that if we're not having them, we should start having them, and we need to be having them. I know it's part of what we're concerned here with in a general way, and why we've started a Center for Missions and Evangelism. That my dear brother Eric Watkins here, who is, I think, very sensitized to all these issues. He does not want the church to politicize. I know Eric very well. He believes in the proper spirituality of the church, but he also wants the church to do its job and not to be irrelevant, not to render itself irrelevant by just withdrawing into itself. So I say we need to reach out beyond our typical constituencies. I mean, our churches have tended to have, whether it's ethnic constituencies of a certain sort, and just from a viability point of view, it's not going to continue. I mean, a church that just relies on Scottish people or Dutch people or whatever people to people them is going to ultimately go out of existence if that's just what it relies on, because that's not going to keep. That's going to lessen over the course of time. It will lessen over the course of time. And you want more people to come in and enjoy, as I say, while maintaining clear Reformed distinctives without dumbing down, reaching out without dumbing down. And of course, that's one of the best titles of a book, I think, ever. Marva Dawn's book. Just that title, really, I think I'm been the president of the board for some time. I'm the vice president. We go back and forth, president and vice president, between the OP and the PCA of Great Commission publications. And that's what we talk about all the time, because we want in our materials to reach out without dumbing down. And now we get from some churches, and I understand it, but some think, and I get it, that we've dumbed down because they say, look, they're maybe OPC and they homeschool their kids and they say, my kids know, this stuff, but we're reaching a bigger constituency than that. And the constituency for GCP material, so it's a joint publishing agency of the OPC and the PCA. But do you know it's slightly less than 50% the total use is OPC PCA. That means a little more than half of the entire buyers of our materials are not Presbyterians, OPC, PCA. They're from more liberal Presbyterian churches in some cases, and they want this material. They're from Christian Reformed churches or other churches like that, and they don't like the materials their churches are producing. I'm just being very blunt here. They're from the other kind of churches that are maybe independent or whatever and are kind of not sure where they should go. Some are from ARP churches. Some are from EPC churches. Some are, there's just such a variety. And we think that's a very important ministry of our churches to the broader churches, to produce good materials that can be used, that are Reformed, and yes, they may not be as smart as your really smart kids need and deserve. Now, I say that with a little bit of tongue in cheek. I mean, I've been around a lot. I don't mean to, I just have to say this one. It's there, I'm sorry. I remember being in a house, this was some years back, and here we are. I'd spoken in the conference, and I'm there with these people, wonderful people I've been told I'm having dinner with. Fine, I'm having dinner with them, great people. I think he's an elder. And so I'm like, I'm talking to the kids. It's always fun to talk. Yeah, I get to know you guys a bit. So tell me about your, And, the mother and father keep, interjecting things, and that's fine. It's their house. They can interject whatever they want to. But he says, well, and Johnny here, and he was a smallish kid. I think he was 11. Something like that. So he should have been in the 5th grade. Maybe it was 6th grade. So so he said the age. Maybe he said 11, 12. And I said, you're in the 6th grade, 7th grade? Johnny doesn't answer. Mom or Dad does. I forget which one. No, he's in the 12th grade. And I'm like starting to eat something, and I hope I didn't. I'm kind of like spit the coffee out. I'm like, excuse me, what? And he said, oh, he's in. And they go on about how he's. And I mean, the kid is really shy, but maybe he's just real bookworm. But even there, I mean, maybe he reads on a 12th grade level. That's quite believable. I understand that. But they say he's in the 12th grade, and I question this a little bit, and I'm thinking this all seems really very unhealthy. And I said, and I just came out, and they all looked at me, and I said, so he's been thoroughly tested to somehow ascertain that that's what he should be in? And they're like, well, he's worked through our curriculum. I said, well, that didn't answer my question. I'm realizing I really have to behave myself here, because we might get into a bit of an argument here, because I didn't think the parents had a clue as to what they were doing, frankly. And the whole thing was really bizarre. And that was an extreme example, but I've run into less extreme examples where, here's this kid who looks like he needs to go out and get some fresh air or something, but he's in the 12, or he's we hope that he gets hired by the college over here as a professor soon. I don't know. It's just like, yeah, Well, you and who else thinks that? I mean, at any rate, we can get in. Part of this is just to say we can get in our own little enclaves. We can get very tribal, very, very tribal, and just define our own little worlds. Those who care about the truth, this is the lure to us. I mean, those who don't care about the truth, the lure is just whatever goes, anything goes, right? People who care about the truth, the lure becomes a kind of tribalism, a kind of get away from our truth, step back from the truth, and not something that we're eager to give away so much. So I say we must not be so afraid of the latter that we refuse or fail to be properly what Paul was, all things to all people. Clearly, this involved both some real change on Paul's part that at the same time involved no compromise of the truth. So I do think he's giving us an apostolic example there. A few little remarks from what we've talked about. Race is important. So I've had folks in our church say, like, why is race so important here? Why is that? Well, you need to study American history some. This isn't just being made up that race is an important part of our whole culture. It is. It's here in a particular way because the particular form and shape that African slavery took. Class is also important. That's obvious elsewhere, but it's underplayed here. I mean, Britain openly says, yes, we have class distinctions. We can't even admit that in America. In fact, I mean, people will say, we don't have class distinctions here. But we do. We have racial distinctions. We have class distinctions. We have these distinctions. But it's interesting how Americans particularly don't like to say they have any class distinctions. I mean, the British can't deny it. I mean, they have still an aristocracy and all this, or you're going to have, but you don't have to have an aristocracy to just have class distinctions. And my point isn't class distinctions are all wrong. That's not even my point. Every kind of distinction is wrong. That's not at all my point. It's just we won't even admit them. Which doesn't allow you to be honest about the whole place. We need to be honest about things. Our churches have had limited outreach, as I've said above, and I think, how can we enlist our people in even thinking and praying about this? And going beyond that, how do we actually reach out and bring in the other in terms of these things, race, gender, socioeconomic status? How do we, and I'm using here a term from Jack Miller, outgrow the ingrown church? That's a good phrase. Now, everything Jack said here, I don't agree with it. I agree with him recognizing, though, that the church is ingrown and it needs to be outgrown. Jack starts the New Life movement. Jack himself is, as always the case, is in my view, is much better than the movement that follows. In other words, I knew Jack. Jack was a very smart man, a very capable man. But many people in the broader New Life movement don't have his abilities and so forth, and it just kind of gives the baby away with the bathwater, I think. But it still leaves us the question. So, in other words, do we look at something like the New Life movement and say, well, glad that's over with? Or do we say, what happened was Jack in the 50s and 60s, he got involved with sharing the Reformed faith with literally, this sounds all stereotypical, but bikers and biker gangs. And he's saying, this is for everybody. Everybody needs to hear this. And in fact, couldn't this have a particular play to the down and out? Think about it. Think about how much American religion is about. It sounds like a business seminar. You can be anything you want and da-da-da-da-da-da, and God's best life for you now. And you're like, this isn't biblical Christianity, because biblical Christianity doesn't come in and say, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. But so much of American Christianity is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. True Christianity is God comes to you in all of your sin and misery, and He pulls you up. So look to Him, trust in Him. It's all about Him. Rely on Him. So we have a message for the down and out that Arminianism doesn't have. A do-it-yourself kind of a thing. We're not saying you've got to save yourself. We're saying there is salvation full and free. It's a gift. Receive it as such. So, well, you can turn over then to 6, and we've talked a lot about that. Tisby and so forth, what's going on there. Dr. King, I talk about attempts to redefine America. It's interesting. I mentioned Howard Zinn's People's History. When I was in, it's interesting, when I was in history graduate school, this is sort of how far we've come. I was in a graduate school that very much stressed material culture and New Left social history. So it was hardly traditional. It was quite to the left. But if you would have said Howard Zinn's People's History, they would have been like, ha, 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 that's just some kind of a populist leftist thing. That's not serious scholarship. And back then, even progressives and leftists took scholarship somewhat seriously. Now it's all become so partisan, so nakedly partisan, so openly partisan in a kind of postmodern context that, you know, Howard Zinn, which was very marginal, you and serious students of history didn't take him seriously. And certainly he would have never been read in a high school setting because you would have a more mainstream kind of a history. And this kind of thing is being read right now in a high school setting. The 1619 Project, Howard Zinn, very radical, progressive, leftist approaches are going on in high schools. The election last week reflected some of this, that some people saying, just regular people, I don't mean necessarily church people at all, but regular people saying, this has gone too far. There's this, you know, this kind of an approach. In other words, when you talk about, well, even from a progressive standpoint, do we want to say the kind of thing King said, which is one thing, or what Antifa BLM says, as I put it up here, America is fatally flawed and all our institutions must be torn down and reconstructed along revolutionary lines. I mean, that's a big part of a message. And but I think a lot of just Joe American is kind of like, oh, what? When did this happen? I mean, I'm not for this. But we shouldn't have then the response of we can't be honest about America's racial past and racial problems or problems with any number of things, how things have gone. You don't want to just get to say, you know, I reject all of that and, you know, just make America great again. And I'm not trying to be political on the other side or criticize that so much as there's an air of unrealism if you can't recognize problems because, you know, it always has been recognized by honest people. So I say over here, on page 7, I think we need to develop a position, if we're thinking about how do we go forward with any of this, that appreciates our heritage, recognizing that the best things about it are shared with what's best in other cultures and societies, though America has often taken the lead and in some ways been exceptional. There is some degree of truth to that, but you need a balance. Like John Wilsey has done some really great work on this, critiquing American exceptionalism seriously and biblically and soberly and saying, but it also has some points because America did take a lead in certain areas of freedom and certain things, which of course these areas of freedom isn't exactly something that the progressive left or far left seem to like. It's like a new fascism arising over on that side. You know, it's fascinating what's happening, you know, sort of whatever you want to call it, a kind of cancel culture type of thing, which is very restrictive, which isn't liberal in any historic sense of the word. So you can look at some of the different figures. John Quincy Adams, I mentioned James Traub's book. It's a long book on Quincy Adams. It's a fairly recent one. It's a very good book. But I think he's someone, to me, Charles Hodge regarded Quincy Adams as exemplary in some ways, and I think he is. You mentioned our videographer, our good man there. I want to think of the other words of the lady that got shot by accidentally by our friend in the movie. What do you call it? Cinematographer. I will not shoot you, even though Mr. Baldwin did shoot the cinematographer, but not the sheriff, or no, not the deputy or whatever. But so he mentioned to me Amistad, and of course the great that historically was the case that John Quincy Adams argued before the Supreme Court for the rights and argued for the fair treatment of those slaves who were on board that ship. And he was a remarkable man. Sixth president, did not care for Andrew Jackson, and it was mutual. Andrew Jackson didn't care for him. But Hodge didn't like Andrew Jackson either. It's interesting just to say that, because you would think, well, these are even with Andrew Jackson, you might think, well, that's our concern. Now, isn't he a Presbyterian, and is he a Christian? He, towards the end of his life, becomes a Christian, a real Christian. But early in his life, a lot of people would say, this is an interesting kind of window. Sometimes people miss this. They would say, well, that we would criticize him as a fierce Indian killer is not something that concerned anybody in his own time. And I've read it in Hodge's own hand in correspondence at Princeton University, where Hodge is writing to his brother and says, it's remarkable to even think that we should elect such a man. This is before he was elected. That we would think about electing such a man who has treated the Indians in this country so horribly, and any Christian should be terribly ashamed of the kind of massacre and slaughter that he brought to them. So that it isn't the case that nobody was concerned about this. It's just, we tend to assume that nobody cared. That's just us, No, it's been there. There's been different concerns. I think we can develop a position where we appreciate our heritage, where we critique it, particularly where its traditionalism renders it insular, just us, and it's all about us, and we're the greatest, not you should love your nation and everybody should love their own nation, and hope for it and help it to be the best it can be. Avoiding, on the one hand, a kind of establishmentarian, overly authoritative position, and on the other, conspiracy theories and the rejection of right authority. I have a little thing there. That would be fun to spend some time on. The problem with conspiracy theories of the left or right, they overestimate the role and power. I'll just read what I have there. They overestimate the role and power of man, and they underestimate that of God. There is not a cabal that is in charge of history. God is in charge of history. And you may have collections doing this, that, or the other, but it's, as Luther said about the devil, he's God's devil. So if you got a group doing something, you have to understand, if you listen properly to conspiracy theorists, they are denying God and His power. On the left or the right, because they're saying this big thing is being pulled off, and it's terrible, and we can't do anything about it. And yeah, God is in control. We must always confess this. Somebody even like Rousas Rushdoony. Rushdoony wrote, I remember reading years ago, and he was being very critical of conspiracy theorists and saying, there may be conspiracies of various sorts here and there. There are various sorts of things. But he says, people aren't ruling history. He said, God is. It's like, huh? But we say, but it doesn't look that way. Well, there you go. We walk by faith, not by sight. Right? Post tenebras lux, which was the motto of Calvin's school in Geneva. After the darkness, light. Things were very dark in the Middle Ages. So I'm going to end a little bit with this, with my I've quoted from my own book, and you can do with it what you want to. And there's another one coming. Well, make sure you get that one. It'll be reasonable. Lots of copies out there. Please run out and buy it. And when it comes out, give it as Christmas gifts, so forth. Carl Trueman, in his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, where he's particularly dealing with expressive individualism as it has historically developed and where we are. And I know some of you have read this. Who in here has read this book or taken a peek at it? Oh, good. This is good. Because Carl was at Covenant OPC in Orland Park speaking about this some. He and the Wrights are good friends. They're all back in the old country together. So he ends here. He's coming to an end. Carl's talked about a lot of things, historically done a lot of good historical analysis. And he's talking in this very last section, whither the church. Where's the church go from at this point? And he's giving some specific things that he thinks are necessary. He talks about the church should reflect long and hard on the connection between aesthetics and her core beliefs and practices. And you might say, what does he mean by that? Well, you have to take a peek at the book. I really should be. Carl, I really do need something here for this. I'm puffing your book. Secondly, it says she must be a community. And you understand that right now people, and COVID especially, we talked about this, that this is a theme of the last few decades, that community is hard to come by. But it's in a virtual age, it's gotten even more hard. And nobody would have thought. I mean, there are churches that have, I think some of our churches, I think a lot of I look around the room, I think your churches have done pretty well, or maybe even have flourished in COVID because you were meeting actually in person. I think that's blessed, if I could say. Some of the churches that didn't meet, or they maybe they did the live streaming just for a very long time. There are liberal churches especially where people have never really come back, and it's in doubt whether they're going to come back. There are liberal churches that are going to just die, and in a certain sense, insofar as they're liberal and stay liberal, they don't really deserve otherwise, because they're not preaching the truth, and there's not a community, there's not a loyalty, there's not a community there, because there's just nothing there. There's not a there. There are churches where there's no there, if you know what I mean. And so people are like, why should we bother? COVID sort of showed them how much they didn't need the church. Whereas I think the true people of God, COVID helped show us how much we need the church, how much we need each other, how much we need to be face to face, mano a mano, how much we need to come into contact, and the importance of community, the importance of communion. So Carl's talking about some of this kind of thing. Protestants need to recover both natural law and a high view of the physical body. I agree with him on all this. I may say some different things differently. Nobody's going to say it all the same. But he says this, and I think this is helpful, because I actually say this in my notes. And it was before Carl, these were all written before Carl's book came out. I actually say maybe what we want to look back to in some ways, if we are going to look back to something, is the early church in the 2nd century. And he basically says the same thing. In the 2nd century, the church was a marginal sect within a dominant pluralist society, the Greco-Roman society of the day. The Roman Empire, with that underlying Greek. The Greeks were great at culture. The Romans were kind of mimetic, imitative, if you recall. They were great at government. But the Greeks had all the sort of the intellectual oomph. So I think it's right still to call it kind of Greco-Roman. Not just Roman, but Greco-Roman. That was the atmosphere. The church was under suspicion, not because her central dogmas, and then of course you had the ancient Near Eastern mystery religions, and you had all these philosophical schools. You had all the kind of things we talk about, all those things. She was under suspicion not because her central dogmas were supernatural, but rather because she appeared subversive in claiming Jesus as king, and was viewed as immoral in her talk of eating and drinking human flesh and blood and expressing incestuous sounding love between brothers and sisters. These were the false charges brought, right? This is where we are today. The story told in parts 2 through 4 of this book indicates how a pluralist society has slowly but surely adopted beliefs, particularly beliefs about sexuality and identity, that render Christianity immoral. It's not just that people think Christianity, it's not just scientists saying this is not rational and believable. You've got people saying, you're bigoted haters. You're immoral. That's what they were saying about the early Christians. Not just, your stuff is too supernaturalistic for us to believe, but no, you're immoral. Immoral and inimical to the civic stability of society is now understood. The 2nd century world is, in a sense, our world where Christianity is a choice, and a choice likely at some points to run afoul of the authorities. It was that 2nd century world that laid down the foundations for the later successes of the 3rd and 4th centuries. And she did it by what means? By existing as a close-knit, doctrinally bounded community that required her members to act consistently with their faith and to be good citizens of the earthly city as far as good citizenship was compatible with faithfulness to Christ. How we do that today and where the limits are, he says they're pressing questions that go beyond the scope of this volume. But it's a discussion to which I hope the narratives and analyses I've offered here might help form a helpful prolegomenon. And I would say amen to that, and then in keeping with that, the church must be the church. I end over, you can just read through these, how faith impacts all of life and a right view of the spirituality of the church, pages 8 and 9. I mean, you have these notes, you can look at them. But I say here, we need to make clear that we serve a king, and I'm going to be preaching on this in this brother's church this weekend, a kingdom not of this world. We need to make clear that we serve a king who has brought us into a kingdom not of this world, a kingdom that operates on an utterly different dynamic and has a different ethos, and that does this world the least good. I've said this before, but I end it with this, when it seeks to be most like it. Martin Lloyd-Jones. Martin Lloyd-Jones, I think, absolutely was right when he said, the church is the church, and it does the world the least good when it seeks to be most like the world. The world does not need an echo of itself. The world is going to hell. The world needs to be told about one who has come to take us to heaven. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for what the church is, and we pray that it would ever be it all the more, that it would not give away what it is to become something that it shouldn't be, and something that will help no one anyway. Help it, Lord, to be clear, uncompromising, true, to become all things to all men, to reach out to all those about us with the gospel that has saved us. In Jesus' name, amen.